November 1848. The Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. The silence in the farmhouse was heavier than the frost clinging to the window panes. It was a thick, suffocating quiet that only settled in when the flour barrel was empty and the woodpile was low. Silas Blackwood sat at the rough-hewn kitchen table, the family ledger open before him like a tombstone. He was 32, but the lines etched around his eyes belonged to a man twice his age. Outside, the Shenandoah Valley was a landscape of gray and brown, the skeletal trees standing guard over fields that had betrayed him for 3 years running. First the blight, then the drought, and now the rains that had turned the corn to black mush. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the grit of sleeplessness. The bottom line of the ledger hadn't changed in months. Debt, $700. To the bank in Richmond, it was a number. To Silas, it was a noose. "There is no coffee, Silas." He turned. Ilara stood in the doorway, wrapped in a thin shawl. She was beautiful in a way that hardship couldn't erase, though it tried its hardest. Her eyes, usually bright, were dulled by the same hunger that gnawed at his own belly. "Water will do," Silas said, closing the ledger. He couldn't bear to have her see the numbers. "I'm going into Oak Haven today. I have the silver dollars. I'll get pork and flour." "That's the last of it," she whispered. She didn't mean the food, she meant the money. The 3 silver coins in his pocket were the remnants of his mother's inheritance, the final barrier between them and the poorhouse. "I know," Silas said, standing up to kiss her forehead. Her skin was cold. "I'll figure something out, Ilara. I always do." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The ride into Oak Haven was a trudge through freezing mud. His horse, Jericho, was ribs and resolve, plodding forward with his head down. But as Silas tied Jericho to the rail outside Sterling's general store, he sensed a shift in the air. Usually the town was a sleepy hollow of defeat. Today it buzzed. Men were gathered in tight knots on the boardwalk, their breath pluming in the cold air, voices raised in a feverish pitch. Silas stepped onto the porch, brushing mud from his coat. "What's the commotion?" Elias Torn, the town blacksmith, turned around. His face was smeared with soot, but his eyes were wide and wild. He held a crumpled newspaper in his massive fist. "You haven't heard, Blackwood? It's real. The president himself said so." "Said what?" "The gold." Elias shoved the paper at him. It was a copy of the Baltimore Sun. "In California," he said, "they say the rivers are choking with it. They say a man can pull $1,000 out of the mud before breakfast." Silas took the paper. The headline screamed, "President Polk confirms gold discovery." He scanned the text. "Extraordinary abundance, barely needs digging, fortunes made in days." "Fools talk," Silas grunted, handing the paper back. "California is 3,000 miles of hell away from here. You'd die of thirst before you saw a speck of dust." "Maybe," Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I'm closing the forge, Silas. I'm selling my tools. I leave on Monday." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. Elias was the most practical man he knew. If the blacksmith was chasing this ghost, perhaps it wasn't a ghost after all. Silas entered the store. Mr. Sterling was behind the counter, weighing nails. He looked up, his eyes narrowing behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Silas, you're late on the interest payment." "I'm here for flour," Silas said, placing the coins on the counter, "and salt pork." Sterling took the money, testing a coin with his teeth. "The bank sent a letter, Blackwood. If the $300 isn't paid by January 1st, they foreclose. I can't stop them this time." "January?" Silas felt the blood drain from his face. "I was promised until spring." "Times change," Sterling said coldly. "You have 5 weeks. Find the money, or find a new place to live. The ride home was a blur of panic. The gray sky seemed to press down on him, crushing the air from his lungs. 5 weeks. He couldn't raise $300 in 5 years on that barren farm. He looked at the horizon, where the sun was setting in a bruise of purple and red. West. The whispers he had heard in town, gold, fortune, salvation, began to roar in his ears. It was madness. It was a death sentence, but staying here was a death sentence too, a slow death of pride and shelter. When he walked into the kitchen, Ilara was mending Thomas's trousers by the light of a single tallow candle. She looked up, and she saw it on his face immediately, the fear and the terrible resolve. "What did Sterling say?" she asked quietly. "January 1st, Silas said. He placed the meager sack of flour on the table. We lose the farm in 5 weeks. Ilara dropped the needle. She didn't cry. She was past tears. She just stared at the wall. "Then it's over." "No," Silas said. He sat across from her, taking her hands. They were rough, calloused. "There is a way, Ilara." "The gold?" she said, her voice flat. "You heard the talk." "It's not just talk, Ilara. Elias is going. The president confirmed it. Men are walking into the hills, paupers, and walking out kings." "But how many don't walk out at all?" She pulled her hands away, standing up. "It's a desert, Silas. It's savages and sickness. You want to leave me? Leave your children?" "I want to save you," he shouted, the frustration boiling over. "Look around this room, Ilara. We are drowning. If I stay, we are beggars. If I go, I might just buy us a life. You might die." "I'm dying here already," he whispered. The silence stretched, heavy and taut. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose shingles, a reminder of the winter that would soon bury them. Ilara looked at him for a long time. She saw the desperation, but she also saw the spark that had been missing from his eyes for years, the spark of hope. Slowly, she reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out a small cloth pouch and placed it on the table. "I was saving this for a doctor, if the cough came back." Silas opened it. Inside lay her grandmother's gold locket. "Sell it," she commanded. "Buy a rifle. Buy a warm coat. You can't cross a continent in those rags." "Ilara!" "Go," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Go to California. Chase the sunset. But you swear to me, Silas Blackwood. You swear you don't let the greed take you. You get what we need, and you come home." Silas gripped the locket, his knuckles white. He felt the weight of the gold, so light in his hand, yet heavy enough to change the course of their history. He blew out the candle. The decision was made. The farmer died in the darkness of that kitchen, and the 49er was born. The whispers from the west were no longer whispers. They were a call to arms. December 1848, Oak Haven, Virginia. The price of a legacy was exactly $42. Silas stood outside the pawn shop in Oak Haven, the crisp banknotes folded into a tight square in his palm. Inside, behind the glass, Ilara's grandmother's locket sat in a velvet tray, looking small and orphaned. It was the first time in his life Silas had sold something that belonged to the soul of his family, rather than the soil. It tasted like ash in his mouth. He crossed the street to the outfitter, his boots crunching on the frozen mud. With the $42 plus the last of his silver, he bought the means of his survival: a heavy buffalo hide coat, a new percussion cap rifle, 10 pounds of lead shot, and a stubborn, knock-kneed mule he named Barnaby. By the time he returned to the farm, the Shenandoah Valley was draped in the long, melancholic shadows of winter. The Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance were no longer purple majesties. They were gray walls barring him from the world beyond. That evening, the farmhouse was quieter than a church. The packing was done. It hadn't taken long. A man's life, stripped of sentiment,
fits into 2 saddlebags with room to spare. Silas sat by the hearth, oiling the stock of his new rifle. Thomas, his 6-year-old son, sat on the rug, watching him with wide, watery eyes. The boy's cough had settled for the night, but his breathing was raspy, a sound that tore at Silas's heart. "Papa?" whispered Thomas. "Are you going to fight the Indians?" Silas stopped rubbing the wood. He looked down at his son. "No, Tom. I'm going to walk. Just walk. To the gold place?" "To California, yes." "Is it far?" Silas looked at the map spread out on the table, a crude thing he had copied from a trapper in town. It showed a lot of empty white space labeled Great American Desert. "It's a fair piece," Silas said gently, "but I have Jericho and I have Barnaby. We'll be fine." Sarah, his 8-year-old daughter, didn't ask questions. She had been standing by the window for an hour, staring into the dark. She was old enough to understand that fathers who left didn't always come back. When Silas finally stood up to put the rifle away, she ran to him, burying her face in his flannel shirt. She didn't cry, but she held on so tight he thought she might bruise his ribs. He held her, smelling the soap in her hair and the wood smoke of the house. This scent, this specific mixture of family and home, was what he would miss more than food or warmth. "You look after your mother," he told her, his voice thick. "You're the strong one, Sarah. You remind her to eat. You help with the wood." "I will, Papa," she muffled into his shirt. Later, in the darkness of their bedroom, the silence was unbearable. Ilara lay with her back to him, but the rhythm of her breathing was jagged. Silas reached out, his hand resting on her hip. "I will send money from Independence, and again from Fort Laramie if the post is running." "Just right," Ilara said, her voice small. "I don't care about the money, Silas. Just tell me you're still walking." He pulled her close then, a desperate, clinging embrace. They didn't speak of the mortgage or sterling or the gold. They spoke with their hands and their breath, memorizing the feel of each other, storing it away like provisions for a starving winter. The morning of the departure broke cold and brittle. The frost lay thick on the grass, looking like a dusting of the very silver Silas hoped to find. The sun was a pale, watery disk, struggling to rise over the ridge. Silas dressed in the dark. He put on his new coat, the stiff leather creaking. He checked his pockets, the map, a small Bible, a packet of dried beef, and a lock of Ilara's hair tied with a ribbon. Outside, Jericho was stomping in the cold, his breath pluming in the air. Barnaby, the mule, stood stoically beside him, laden with the pickaxe, the shovel, and the sacks of flour. The family stood on the porch. The moment was come, the terrible, inevitable moment that every immigrant, every soldier, every explorer knows, the severing of the root. Thomas was wrapped in a blanket, shivering. Silas knelt in the mud, ignoring the cold seeping into his knees. He placed his hands on the boy's shoulders. "You get strong, Thomas. You hear me?" Silas said fiercely. "When I come back, I want to see you running to the fence to meet me." "Yes, Papa." He kissed the boy's forehead, then stood to face Sarah. He didn't say a word to her. He just nodded. She nodded, a warrior salute from a little girl. Then Ilara. She wore her gray wool dress, the one she wore to church. She looked pale, stripped of everything but her dignity. She stepped off the porch and into the mud, closing the distance between them. She reached up, adjusting the collar of his coat, her fingers lingering on the leather. "Don't look back," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his. They were dry and hard as flint. "If you look back, Silas, you'll stop, and if you stop, we lose." "I won't," he choked out. "Go," she pushed his chest gently. "Go find our life." Silas mounted Jericho. The saddle felt cold and hard. He grabbed Barnaby's lead rope. He wanted to say something poetic, something worthy of the moment, but his throat was squeezed shut by grief. "I love you," he managed, the words fracturing in the cold air. He turned the horse's head toward the gate. "Don't look back." He spurred Jericho forward. The hooves clattered on the frozen earth, a rhythmic drumbeat of departure. Clack, 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 clack. He rode down the long driveway, past the oak tree his father had planted, past the empty cornfields that had broken his heart. The wind bit at his cheeks, stinging his eyes, giving him an excuse for the tears that blurred his vision. He reached the turn in the road, the spot where the farm would disappear behind the line of trees. His body screamed at him to turn his head. Just one last look, just one glimpse of Ilara standing on the porch. "If you stop, we lose." Silas Blackwood grit his teeth, fixed his eyes on the gray horizon of the west, and rode on. Behind him, the Shenandoah Valley, the cradle of his ancestors, fell into silence. Ahead lay 3,000 miles of wilderness, the Great Divide, and the promise of a golden river. He was no longer a farmer. He was a drift of dust in the wind, blowing west. February 1849, the Missouri River Valley. The world was ending, or at least that's what it sounded like. Silas Blackwood sat rigid on a wooden bench, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of the seat in front of him. The locomotive, a black, fire-breathing beast of iron and soot, screamed as it tore across the landscape. To a farmer from the Shenandoah who had never moved faster than a galloping horse, the speed was terrifying. The trees outside the window blurred into a smear of gray and brown, and the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the wheels sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock. The train car was packed with men. They smelled of stale tobacco, unwashed wool, and desperate optimism. There were lawyers from New York in pristine frock coats, farmers from Ohio with calloused hands, and gamblers from New Orleans shuffling cards with practiced apathy. They were all strangers, yet they were all the same man, the Argonaut, the gold seeker.
"First time on the iron horse?" The voice was deep, rolling like distant thunder. Silas turned to his left. The man sitting next to him was massive, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, wearing a pea coat that had seen better days. His skin was the color of deep mahogany, and his eyes were sharp, scanning the car with a mix of amusement and caution. "Is it that obvious?" Silas asked, loosening his grip on the seat. "You look like you're waiting for the boil of the blow," the man chuckled. He extended a hand, the palm scarred and rough. "Caleb, from New Bedford." "Silas, Virginia." Silas took the hand. It felt like gripping a block of oak. "You're a long way from the sea, Caleb." "Whales are getting scarce, Silas, and they don't pay in nuggets." Caleb looked out the window at the passing farmland. "I spent 10 years chasing oil in the dark water. Figured I'd try chasing gold in the dirt. Same gamble, different scenery." The train lurched, the whistle shrieking again as they approached the end of the line. From here, they would board a steamboat, and then independence, the jumping-off point, the edge of the known world. "You have a company?" Caleb asked, his voice dropping lower. "No, just me, a horse, and a mule." Caleb nodded, looking at the other men in the car, some shouting, some drinking, some arguing over maps. "A man alone is a dead man out there, Silas. The cholera don't care if you're white or black, and the bandits prefer you lonely." Silas looked at Caleb. He saw strength there and a calm intelligence that stood out in the car of frenzied dreamers. "I have a rifle," Silas said, "and I know how to use it, but I don't know the trail." "I know how to read the stars," Caleb replied, "and I can lift a wagon axle by myself. But they won't sell a ticket on a wagon train to a man like me. Not easily." The unspoken reality hung between them. In 1849, the color of Caleb's skin was a barrier higher than the Rockies. Silas didn't hesitate. He thought of Ilara. If you look back, we lose. To survive, he needed the best, and Caleb was clearly the best man in this car. We ride together, Silas said firmly. My mule carries the gear, we split the work, we split the gold. Caleb studied Silas's face, looking for the lie. He found none. A slow grin spread across his face. Deal, but you're cooking. I've had enough of ship's biscuit. Independence, Missouri, 2 weeks later. If the train ride was purgatory, Independence was the gate of Bedlam. The town was less a settlement, more a churning sea of mud, canvas, and shouting. The streets were gridlocked with Conestoga wagons, massive prairie schooners with white canvas bonnets that billowed in the wind. Oxen bellowed, mules kicked, and thousands of men scrambled to buy supplies at prices that would make a thief blush. Silas and Caleb moved through the crowd, leading Jericho and Barnaby. The noise was deafening, the clang of blacksmith hammers, the auctioneer's chant, the drunken brawls spilling out of saloons. "Flour is $10 a barrel," a man shouted near a depot. $10! It was $2 yesterday. "Supply and demand, friend," the shopkeeper yelled back. "You want cheap flour, go back to Ohio." Silas felt the weight of his dwindling money belt. They had enough, but barely. They had joined a loose confederation of wagons, the Liberty Company, led by a stern, bearded man named Captain Elias Thorne, no relation to the blacksmith back home, but just as hard. The company consisted of 20 wagons. Silas and Caleb, having no wagon of their own, were outriders. They paid a fee to store their heavy supplies in the communal wagons and agreed to scout and hunt for the group. The final night before departure, the camp was a restless hive. Fires dotted the riverbank for miles. Fiddles played sad, lilting tunes, songs about girls left behind and mothers weeping. Silas sat by a small fire, writing a letter on a crate. "My dearest Alara, we leave at dawn. The chaos here is beyond description. I have partnered with a man named Caleb. He is strong and steady. Do not worry for me. The weather is turning and the grass is greening. I am pointing my boots west, and I will not stop until I touch the Pacific. Kiss Thomas and Sarah. Tell them their father is riding a storm." He folded the letter and handed it to a post rider heading east. It felt like cutting the last thread of a safety line. "Ready, Virginia?" Caleb stood over him, holding 2 tin cups of coffee. "As I'll ever be," Silas said, taking the cup. "Look at 'em," Caleb gestured to the sprawling camp. "Doctors, teachers, farmers, thieves. Half of 'em don't know which end of the ox to yoke. The prairie is going to eat them alive." "But not us," Silas said. It was a prayer, not a fact. "No," Caleb took a sip, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "We have a ghost to catch. Dawn. The sun didn't rise. It bled into the sky, a pale wash of pink against the gray. The bugle sounded, a sharp brassy note that cut through the morning mist. "Wagons ho!" The cry went up, repeated down the line. "Wagons ho! Roll 'em out!" The sound that followed was the sound of history moving, the crack of bullwhips, crack, like pistol shots, the groan of wood stressing against iron tires, the shouts of gee and haw to the oxen. Silas mounted Jericho. The horse danced, sensing the energy. Beside him, Caleb walked, leading Barnaby, his long legs eating up the ground with an easy stride. They moved past the last wooden building of Independence. They moved past the last fenced field. Ahead of them lay the trail. It wasn't a road. It was a scar cut into the earth by those who had gone before. It stretched out into the rolling green hills of Kansas, winding toward the horizon where the sky met the earth. Silas looked down at the pommel of his saddle. He touched the stock of his rifle. He took a deep breath, tasting the cold, clean air of the frontier. Behind him was the iron horse, the symbol of the world he knew. Ahead was the wagon trail, the path to the unknown. He didn't look back. "Let's go, Caleb," Silas said. "Westward," Caleb replied. They crossed the invisible line. The noise of the town faded, replaced by the creak of wheels and the wind in the tall grass. The great migration had begun, and they were just two specks of dust in a storm that would change the nation forever. May 1849, the Nebraska Territory. The Platte River was a liar. From a distance, under the noon sun, it looked like a ribbon of silver, promising cool relief to the parched throats of man and beasts. But up close, it was a sluggish, muddy beast, a mile wide and an inch deep, as Caleb had grunted, spitting into the brown water. It was too thick to drink and too thin to plow, and it stank of rotting vegetation and the thousands of animals that had trudged along its banks before them. Pull up, damn ya!" The shout came from 3 wagons ahead. The train ground to a halt, the screech of iron brakes piercing the humid air. Silas reined in Jericho, wiping sweat from his eyes. "Another one?" Caleb asked, looking weary. His boots were caked in mud, and his usually bright eyes were rimmed with red fatigue. "Looks like the Miller wagon," Silas said, squinting. "Old man Miller hasn't looked right for 2 days."
They rode forward to investigate. A small crowd had gathered around the wagon. Mrs. Miller was weeping, a sound that was becoming terrifyingly familiar on the trail. Beside the wagon, on a patch of buffalo grass, lay a fresh mound of earth. It wasn't old man Miller. It was his youngest son, barely 12. He had been laughing at breakfast. He was dead by lunch. Captain Thorne stood by the grave, holding his hat in his hand. He looked like a man trying to hold back a landslide with a shovel. "We keep moving," Thorne announced, his voice cracking slightly. "We can't stop. The contagion is in the ground here. We have to outrun it." "Outrun it!" a woman shrieked. "It's in the wagons. It's in the water. We need to rest. We need to boil everything." "If we rest, we die," Thorne said grimly. "We're losing daylight. Mount up." The cruelty of the trail was absolute. There was no time for mourning. The boy was left behind, a small wooden cross, the only marker in a sea of grass that would soon swallow it whole. That night, they made camp near Chimney Rock. The massive spire of stone jutted out of the prairie like a warning finger pointing at God. It was a landmark of progress, but tonight it felt like a tombstone. Silas and Caleb sat away from the main circle. They boiled their water aggressively, watching the bubbles rise with intense scrutiny. 5 graves in 3 days, Caleb said quietly, chewing on a piece of tough jerky. "At this rate, there won't be anyone left to dig by the time we hit Fort Laramie." "It's the water," Silas said. "We have to be careful. No drinking from the river unless it's boiled, no matter how thirsty we get." Caleb looked at the camp. The mood was somber. There were no fiddles tonight, just the low murmurs of prayer and the sound of coughing. "Silas," Caleb said, hesitating, If the cramps take me." "Don't," Silas cut him off. "If they take me," Caleb insisted, his voice hard, "you don't wait. You take the rifle. You take the gold dust if we have any, and you leave me. You don't drag a dying man across the Rockies." Silas looked at his friend. In just a few months, the bond between them had become stronger than blood. They slept back to guard against thieves. They shared their last coffee beans. "I'm not leaving you, Caleb, and you're not leaving me. We made a deal, 50-50 on the gold. You can't spend your half if you're dead in Nebraska." Caleb chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Stubborn Virginia mule." "Stubborn New Bedford whale," Silas retorted. Their banter was interrupted by a scream. It tore through the camp, high and shrill. "Help! Someone help him!" Silas grabbed his rifle instinctively. They ran toward the sound. It was the wagon of a young couple from Ohio, the Andersons. Peter Anderson was on the ground, writhing. His face was a mask of blue-gray pallor, his eyes sunken. The dehydration was hitting him with the speed of a lightning strike. The cholera didn't just kill, it drained a man dry in hours. His wife, Sarah, the same name as Silas's daughter, was clutching his hand, hysterical. "He was fine. He just drank some water from the barrel." The other migrants stood back, a circle of fear. No one wanted to touch him. To touch was to risk infection. Silas looked at the circle of paralyzed men. He looked at Peter, a man who had helped him fix an axle just yesterday. "Get me a blanket," Silas barked, handing his rifle to Caleb. "Silas, no," Caleb warned. "You touch him, you might not wake up tomorrow." "He's freezing, Caleb. Look at him." Silas stepped forward, kneeling in the dirt. He grabbed Peter's shoulders. The man was cold as ice, despite the heat of the night. "Peter, listen to me. Breathe." Peter's eyes rolled back. "Thirsty," he croaked. "Get the water, the boiled water. Mix it with salt and sugar if you have it." For 4 hours, Silas and the wife fought for Peter's life. They forced water down his throat. They rubbed his limbs to stop the cramping. Caleb, despite his warning, stepped in to help, using his immense strength to hold the thrashing man down. Around midnight, the cramping stopped. Peter fell into a fitful sleep. He was pale, but he was breathing steadily. Silas stumbled back from the wagon, his hands trembling. He walked to the edge of the camp, scrubbed his hands with lye soap and sand until they were raw and bleeding, and then scrubbed them again. Caleb stood beside him, pouring water over Silas's hands. "You're a fool," Silas said softly. "I know. You saved him. Maybe. Or maybe I just bought him a few more days." They looked up at Chimney Rock, silhouetted against the stars. The vastness of the prairie made them feel insignificant. The Platte River rushed by in the darkness, a constant murmuring threat. "We need to leave the wagon train," Silas said suddenly. Caleb looked at him. "And go where? Alone?" "This train is moving too slow. The sickness is festering here because we're clustered together like sheep. If we ride ahead, just the two of us, with the horses and the mule, we can move faster. We can find clean water upstream." "It's dangerous, Silas. Indians, bandits." "Staying here is death," Silas said grimly. "We're losing daylight. Mount up." Then Silas and Caleb mounted up. They didn't say goodbye to Captain Thorne. They didn't say goodbye to the Andersons. They simply turned their mounts away from the circle of wagons and trotted into the tall grass. As the sun rose, casting long, stretching shadows across the Platte River, the two men were just silhouettes against the light, small, fragile, but moving faster than the death that nipped at their heels. The safety of the herd was gone. The wildness of the West had truly begun. July 1849, the Rocky Mountains, Wyoming Territory. The world had stopped being horizontal. For months, the journey had been a study in flatness, the endless, maddening green ocean of the prairies. Now the world was vertical. It was a wall of granite and ice that scraped the belly of the sky. It was a landmark of progress, but tonight it felt like a tombstone. Silas and Caleb sat away from the main circle. They boiled their water aggressively, watching the bubbles rise with intense scrutiny. 5 graves in 3 days, Caleb said quietly, chewing on a piece of tough jerky. "At this rate, there won't be anyone left to dig by the time we hit Fort Laramie." "It's the water," Silas said. "We have to be careful. No drinking from the river unless it's boiled, no matter how thirsty we get." Caleb looked at the camp. The mood was somber. There were no fiddles tonight, just the low murmurs of prayer and the sound of coughing.
An hour later, the trail narrowed. To the left was a sheer drop of 300 feet into a canyon where a river roared, looking like a white thread from this height. To the right, a wall of rock. Barnaby stopped. The mule planted his feet and refused to move. "Come on, you stubborn ox!" Caleb pulled the rope. Barnaby brayed and jerked his head back. The pack saddle shifted. "Watch the balance!" Silas shouted, surging forward. "He's tipping!" The heavy packs, filled with their flour, lead, and tools, tilted dangerously toward the cliff edge. Barnaby's rear hoof scrabbled on the slate, sending a shower of pebbles into the abyss. The mule panicked, rearing up. "Let him go!" Silas yelled. "Caleb, drop the rope or he'll pull you over!" Caleb didn't let go. He wrapped the rope around his forearm, planted his boots against a boulder, and leaned back with a roar of exertion. His muscles bulged under his coat. For a terrifying second, it was a tug of war between gravity and the whaler's strength. Silas threw himself at the mule's flank, shoving the animal's weight back toward the rock wall. "Heave!" Caleb shouted. With a final desperate scramble, Barnaby regained his footing. The pack slammed against the cliff face. The mule stood shivering, eyes wide with terror. Caleb slumped against the rock, his chest heaving. He looked at the drop, then at Silas. "You told me to let go," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. "I didn't want you to fall," Silas snapped, the adrenaline making him angry. "The supplies can be replaced. You can't." "Without those supplies, we starve in the Great Basin," Caleb retorted, unwinding the rope from his bruised arm. "Don't you ever tell me to let go of our life, Silas." They glared at each other, two men bound by necessity, fraying at the edges. The trust was there, but it was being tested by the sheer brutality of the landscape. "Let's move," Silas said finally, breaking the gaze, "before he freezes up." They reached the summit in the late afternoon. It wasn't a jagged peak, as Silas had imagined. South Pass was a broad, open valley, a strange plateau suspended in the clouds. The wind here was fierce, stripping away the sound of their footsteps. They stopped at a small spring bubbling up from the mossy ground. It looked insignificant, just a puddle of clear, freezing water. Silas knelt beside it. He watched the water trickle away. "Look," Silas pointed. Caleb knelt beside him. "What?" "The water," Silas whispered. "Look which way it flows." Back on the plains, every creek, every river, every raindrop flowed east. They flowed toward the Mississippi, toward the Atlantic, toward home, toward Ilara. But this water flowed west. It trickled away from them, destined for the Green River, the Colorado, and eventually the Pacific Ocean. "The Great Divide," Caleb said softly. He took off his hat. The reality of it hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. This was the spine of the continent. Standing here, they were straddling two worlds. Behind them lay the past, the debts, the failures, the families they loved. Ahead lay the future, the gold, the danger, the unknown. There was no turning back now. Gravity was on the side of the west. Silas dipped his cup into the spring and drank. The water was sweet and so cold it made his teeth ache. He handed the cup to Caleb. "To the Pacific," Silas proposed a toast, his voice solemn. "To the gold," Caleb drank deep. They stood up and looked out at the horizon. To the west, the sun was beginning to dip, casting the distant peaks in gold and violet. But below the peaks, the land looked different. It was browner, harsher. The lushness of the eastern slopes was gone. "The trapper in Independence," Caleb said, wiping his mouth. "The mountains are the easy part. He said the hell is what comes after." Silas nodded. He could see it. The Great Basin, the desert, a wasteland of sagebrush and alkali dust that stretched for hundreds of miles before they would see the Sierra Nevada. "We've crossed the roof of the house," Silas said, tightening the cinch on Jericho. "Now we have to walk through the cellar." The tension from the cliff incident had evaporated, replaced by a shared, grim resolve. They were small men in a big land, but they had conquered the ascent. Silas reached into his pocket and touched the lock of Ilara's hair.
He felt a sudden sharp pang of distance. Every step he took now moved him further away from her, not just in miles, but in spirit. He was becoming a creature of the West. He wondered if the man who eventually walked back east would be a stranger to her. "Write it down, Silas," Caleb said, breaking his reverie. "Put it in that journal of yours. July 14th, we spit into the Pacific." Silas smiled, a cracked, dry smile. "I will." They mounted up. The descent began. It was easier on the lungs, but harder on the knees. The sun dropped behind the jagged teeth of the horizon, and the long shadow of the Rockies stretched out before them, pointing the way to California. They had crossed the Great Divide. The whisper of the West was no longer a call, it was a command. August 1849, the Great Basin, Nevada Territory. The sun was not a celestial body, it was a hammer. It hung directly overhead, a blinding white disk in a sky bleached of all color, pounding the earth with a rhythmic, heat-shimmering violence. There was no sound in the Badlands, no birds, no wind, no insects, just the dry crunch of boots on alkali crust and the wheezing breath of dying men. Silas Blackwood walked because stopping meant dying. His lips were cracked into a map of dried blood. His tongue felt like a piece of felt stuffed into his mouth, too large and too dry to move. He looked at the horizon. It wobbled like mercury. "Drink," he croaked. The word was a ghost of a sound. Caleb, walking 3 paces ahead, didn't turn. He couldn't. To turn was to waste energy. He just shook his head slowly. The canteen bouncing against his hip made a hollow metallic clank. It was the sound of emptiness. They had entered the sink, the 40-mile desert, 2 days ago. The map promised a spring at the halfway point. The map was a lie. The spring was a patch of cracked mud surrounded by the skeletons of oxen that had arrived too late. Now the landscape was a nightmare of white salt and gray sagebrush. The dust was alkaline. It burned the skin like lye and stung the eyes until they watered, wasting precious moisture. Silas stumbled. His boot caught on a root, and he went down hard, his face hitting the hot grit. He didn't get up immediately. The ground was warm. It felt like a bed. "Why not sleep?" a voice whispered in his ear. It sounded like Ilara. "Just for a moment, Silas. Close your eyes." He saw her. She was standing in the shimmering heat waves, wearing her blue Sunday dress. She was holding a pitcher of iced lemonade, the condensation dripping down the glass. "Silas," she smiled, "come home." He reached out a trembling hand toward the vision. His fingers brushed the hot sand. A hand gripped the collar of his coat and hauled him up. The vision shattered into dust. "Don't you do it, you son of a," Caleb rasped, his eyes sunken, surrounded by dark bruises of exhaustion. "She was there," Silas mumbled, swaying. "Water." "There's no water here, just the devil's spit," Caleb said, shoving Silas forward. "Move." They trudged on. The animals were in worse shape than the men. Jericho, the bay horse, walked with his head dragging the ground, his ribs showing through his dusty coat. Barnaby, the mule, was stoic, but his ears drooped and his gait was staggering. An hour later, they came across a wagon. It was abandoned, sitting alone in the vast whiteness. The canvas was tattered, flapping lazily in a sudden hot breeze. Beside it lay a mahogany dresser, a grandfather clock, and a trunk of books, the treasures of a life, discarded to lighten the load. Silas walked to the wagon. He needed shade. He leaned against the wheel, his head spinning. "Check the barrels," Caleb ordered, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer.
Silas tapped the water barrel strapped to the side. Thud. Solid wood. Dry as a bone. He pulled the bung anyway. A spider crawled out. "Nothing," Silas whispered. He slid down the wheel to sit in the sliver of shade. He pulled the locket from his pocket. It burned his fingers. He opened it. Elira's face stared back, cool and composed. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the picture. "I tried." "Get up," Caleb said. He was standing by the mule, stroking its nose.
Barnaby was sniffing the air, his nostrils flaring. "I can't," Silas said. The fight had drained out of him. The thirst was no longer a pain. It was a heavy narcotic blanket. "You take the horse. Go." Caleb walked over and kicked Silas's boot. "I said, get up. Look at the mule." Silas forced his eyes open. Barnaby was no longer drooping. The mule had turned his head toward the north, toward a cluster of jagged red rocks rising out of the salt flats. He was pulling against the lead rope, making a low honking sound. "He smells it," Caleb said, a spark of life returning to his eyes. "Or he's mad," Silas said. "Mules don't go mad. Men do. Mules survive." Caleb grabbed Silas's arm and hoisted him up. "One more mile. If there's nothing there, we lie down, but not here." They followed the mule. The animal dragged them now, his survival instinct overriding his exhaustion. They stumbled toward the red rocks. The heat seemed to intensify, radiating off the stone ovens. As they rounded the base of the largest rock, they saw it. It wasn't a river. It wasn't a creek. It was a seep, a dark, muddy patch of ground where the earth wept moisture. Silas fell to his knees. He didn't care about the mud. He didn't care about the alkali crust. He clawed at the ground with his bare hands, digging a hole. Caleb dropped beside him, digging with a knife. Slowly, agonizingly, the hole began to fill. Brown, sludge-like water seeped in. Silas lowered his face to the mud. "Wait!" Caleb slapped his shoulder. "Let it settle. You drink that sludge, you'll vomit. You lose that fluid, you die." It was the hardest test of discipline Silas had ever faced, staring at the water, his body screaming for it. They waited 5 minutes. It felt like 5 years. The mud settled slightly. Caleb took his neckerchief, stained with sweat and dust, and pressed it into the hole. The fabric soaked up the liquid, filtering out the worst of the grit. He handed the cloth to Silas. "Suck on it." Silas put the rag in his mouth. The taste was foul, metallic, salty, and like wet dog, but it was wet. Oh God, it was wet. It flowed over his tongue, trickling down his throat like liquid life. He squeezed the cloth, getting every drop. He handed it back to Caleb. Caleb did the same, closing his eyes as the water hit his system. They took turns for an hour, digging, waiting, filtering, drinking. Then they watered the animals, using Caleb's hat as a bucket. Jericho drank greedily, his sides heaving. Barnaby drank with a smug satisfaction. When they had had their fill, Silas sat back against the red rock. He felt sick, his stomach churning at the sudden intake, but the fog in his brain had cleared. He looked at his hands. They were caked in mud. He looked at Caleb. The big man was wiping his face, leaving streaks of brown war paint. "We almost died," Silas said. It wasn't a question. "We did," Caleb nodded. He looked out at the desert they had just crossed. It shimmered in the afternoon heat, a beautiful, deadly furnace. "The desert don't care, Silas. It don't care about your farm. It don't care about my freedom. It just wants our bones." Silas touched the locket in his pocket again. But it didn't get them. Not today. "Not today," Caleb agreed. He stood up, looking west. "Look!" Silas stood. In the far distance, rising above the heat haze like a fortress of clouds, was a line of jagged purple peaks tipped with white. "The Sierra Nevada," Silas breathed. "The last wall," Caleb said. Sacramento was on the other side. The mountains looked impossibly high, impossibly far, but they were there, real, tangible. Silas spit the taste of alkali from his mouth. He felt the hardening in his soul. The farmer from Virginia who had boarded the train was gone. The man who had crossed the Badlands was something else, something forged in fire and quenched in mud. "Let's ride," Silas said, mounting a revitalized Jericho. They moved out, leaving the red rocks behind. They were still thirsty, they were still starving, but they were alive, and in the Badlands, survival was the only victory that mattered. October 1849, Sacramento City, California. They smelt it before they saw it. After months of breathing the dry, sterile air of the high desert and the sharp, pine-scented wind of the Sierras, the air here was heavy. It was a thick, humid soup that smelled of river mud, roasting meat, curing tobacco, and the sweat of 10,000 men. Silas Blackwood reined in Jericho at the crest of the final ridge. Beside him, Caleb sat atop a weary Barnaby. They were scarecrows, gaunt, bearded, their clothes stained with the dust of 6 territories, their boots held together by raw hope and leather scraps. Below them lay the valley. It was a bowl of golden haze, pierced by the winding ribbon of the Sacramento River, and there, sprawling along the banks like a frantic canvas ant colony, was the city. Sacramento, Silas whispered. The word felt strange on his cracked lips. For 6 months it had been a prayer. Now it was a place. It ain't exactly the New Jerusalem, Caleb noted dryly, squinting against the glare. It wasn't. It was a chaotic mess of tents, shanties made of packing crates, and half-finished wooden buildings. But to Silas, it was beautiful. It was the finish line. Let's go. Let's see if the streets are paved. As they rode down into the chaos, the sheer scale of the madness hit them. The riverfront was a forest of masts. Hundreds of ships were moored there, bobbing listlessly in the current. "Where are the crews?" Silas shouted over the din of the street. "Gone," Caleb pointed to a rotting schooner. "Look, no sails, no watchmen. They dropped anchor and ran for the hills." They navigated through the muddy streets. The golden dates of Sacramento were made of canvas flaps and rough timber. The noise was a physical assault. Hammers banged, mules brayed, and men shouted in dozen languages: Spanish, French, Cantonese, and the varied dialects of the American East. It was a carnival of the desperate. Silas saw a man in a silk top hat arguing with a man wearing a blanket. He saw a table set up in the mud where a man was weighing gold dust on a brass scale, surrounded by eyes that glittered with greed. "We need supplies," Silas said, patting his empty saddlebags. "We have the rifle, but we need pans, shovels, and fresh food. I haven't eaten anything that wasn't salted since Wyoming." They tied their animals to a crowded hitching post outside a large tent with a sign painted on a barrel lid: Sam's Emporium, Tools and Provisions. Inside, the tent was stifling hot and packed with goods: barrels of flour, stacks of pickaxes, jars of pickles, and bolts of denim. Silas approached the counter. The shopkeeper was a sweating, balding man with eyes that darted around like a nervous bird. "Help you?" the man grunted. "We need a shovel," Silas said, "and a pick, and a dozen eggs if you have 'em." "Shovel is $15, the man said flatly. "Pick is $12. Eggs are $3 apiece." Silas froze. He felt Caleb tense beside him. "You're joking," Silas said. "A shovel cost $1 in Virginia. You ain't in—"
Night fell over the tent city, and the energy shifted from manic to dangerous. Lanterns glowed through the canvas walls, turning the tents into glowing paper lanterns. Music drifted from the gambling halls, fiddles, pianos, and the raucous laughter of men who had found color and men who were drinking to forget they hadn't. Silas and Caleb set up a small lean-to near a grove of oak trees on the outskirts of the main camp. They were too poor for a hotel and too wary for the crowded bunkhouses. They sat by a small fire, the $15 shovel gleaming in the firelight between them. "We're broke, Silas," Caleb said, poking the fire. "We got a shovel, a mule, and $5. "We have the claim," Silas said, staring into the flames. "We head upriver tomorrow, to the American River, Coloma. That's where it started." "And if it's all gone?" Caleb asked. "Look at this city, Silas. There are thousands of them. They've been here for months." "It's not gone," Silas said, touching his chest pocket where Laura's letter lay. "It can't be." A shadow fell over them. Silas's hand went to his Colt instantly. A man stumbled into their light. He was old, his beard white and matted, his clothes hanging off him like rags. He held a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a small leather pouch in the other. "Evening, pilgrims," the old man slurred. "Fresh off the trail?" "Keep moving, old-timer," Caleb rumbled. "Just being neighborly," he giggled. He tossed the leather pouch to Silas. "Here, a welcome gift."
Silas caught it. It was heavy. He opened the drawstring. Inside, glimmering in the firelight, was dust. Yellow, heavy dust. "Gold?" Silas asked, his breath catching. "The real deal," the old man grinned, revealing toothless gums. "Pulled it out of the Yuba last week. Kept me in whiskey for 3 days." "Why give it to us?" Caleb asked, suspicious. "'Cause there's plenty more," the old man laughed, a sound that bordered on madness. "The rivers are paved with it. But let me tell you something, boys." He leaned in, his eyes wide and haunted. "The gold is easy. It's the keeping it that's hard. The river takes your back, the camps take your soul, and the winter takes the rest." He snatched the bottle back and stumbled away into the dark, singing a broken verse of "O Susanna." Silas looked at the pouch. It was maybe half an ounce. $8? $10? It was real. It wasn't a myth. He poured a few flakes into his palm. They caught the light of the fire, mesmerizing and cold. "It's real, Caleb," Silas whispered. Caleb looked at the dust, then at the shovel. "Then tomorrow we dig." Silas lay back on his bedroll, looking up at the strange stars of California. The noise of the city, the shouting, the gambling, the fighting, was a roar in the distance. He had expected the Golden Gates to be a place of arrival. He realized now it was just another departure point. The journey across the plains was one test. The test of the mines would be another. He thought of the shopkeeper's sneer. "You ain't in Virginia." No, he wasn't. He was in the land of the golden calf. He closed his hand over the gold dust, making a fist. He would not let the river take his back. He would not let the camp take his soul. "Good night, Silas," Silas said. "Night, Silas." The golden gates had opened, swallowing them whole. Tomorrow, the real work began. November 1849, the North Fork of the American River. The river was a thief. It didn't give, it had to be robbed. Silas Blackwood stood knee-deep in water that had been snow only hours before. It was a cold that didn't just numb the skin, it seized the marrow of the bone, turning feet into blocks of ice and making the simple act of standing an exercise in agony. He bent over, his spine protesting with a sharp, hot spike of pain that had become his constant companion. He drove the shovel into the river bottom, fighting the current that tried to sweep his legs away. He lifted a shovel full of gravel, heavy, wet, and sucking, and dumped it into the rocker box Caleb was manning on the bank. "Again," Caleb grunted. Silas bent, dug, lifted, dumped. Mud. It was everywhere. It was in his hair, under his nail blacks, in his food, and seemingly in his soul. The banks of the American River were a slurry of churned earth, turned into a quagmire by thousands of boots and shovels. "Swing it," Silas gasped, leaning on his shovel handle to catch his breath. Caleb rocked the wooden cradle back and forth, pouring water over the gravel with a tin can. The contraption, a crude device they had built from scavenged wood, rattled and sloshed. The theory was simple. Gold was heavy. It would settle behind the wooden cleats, the riffles at the bottom, while the lighter dirt and rocks washed away. Theory was clean. Reality was dirty. Silas stopped rocking. He peered into the bottom of the box. He poked at the black sand with a calloused finger. Silas held his breath. This was the ritual. Every hour, the stop, the look, the hope, the disappointment. Caleb scraped the sand out. "Color," he said flatly, "but it's flour. Flour gold. Microscopic specks that glittered like dust. You could work for 12 hours to get a pinch." Silas slumped. "How much?" "Maybe $2 worth for the whole morning." $2. A loaf of stale bread cost $3. Silas waded out of the water, his boots squelching. He sat heavily on a wet rock, shivering uncontrollably as the wind cut through his damp flannel shirt. "We're digging in the wrong spot, Silas," Silas snapped, pulling the leather glove off his hand, revealing blisters that had burst and bled, turning his palm into raw meat. January 1st, Caleb. The bank takes the farm. I need a nugget. I need a vein. He looked down the river. The canyon was filled with men doing exactly the same thing. Bending, digging, freezing. Some sang, some cursed. Most were silent, broken by the sheer monotony of the labor. It wasn't an adventure anymore. It was a factory line, and the product was misery. The sun reached its zenith, offering light but little warmth in the shadowed canyon. Silas was back in the water. He was operating on autopilot, his mind drifting to Virginia, to the warmth of the hearth. Then he saw it. He had dug deep, past the gravel, down to the blue clay that sat on the bedrock. As he turned the shovel over, a rock tumbled out. It was the size of a walnut, and it gleamed. It caught a ray of sunlight and exploded with a brilliant, brassy yellow shine. Silas froze. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He dropped the shovel. He plunged his hand into the freezing water and snatched the rock up. It was heavy. It was bright. It was perfect. "Caleb!" Silas screamed. The sound tore from his throat, raw and primal. "Caleb, bring the pan!" Caleb dropped the rocker handle and slid down the mud bank. What is it?" Silas held out his hand, trembling. The yellow stone sat in his palm, mocking the gray world around them with its brilliance. "Look at it," Silas whispered, tears mixing with the river water on his face. "It's the mother lode. We found it." Caleb's eyes went wide. He reached out, hesitating, as if to touch it would make it vanish. He took the stone. He weighed it in his hand. "It's heavy," Caleb said. "Must be 3 ounces." 3 ounces, Silas laughed, a hysterical sound. "That's $50, maybe 60. Caleb, if there's one, there's more. We're rich. We're going home." The exhaustion vanished. The cold vanished. Silas felt flunk. He grabbed Caleb's shoulder, shaking him. "We did it!" Caleb didn't smile. He was frowning, looking closely at the stone. He pulled his knife from his belt. "Don't," Silas said, his smile faltering. "Don't scratch it." "Gold is soft, Silas," Caleb murmured. "You can dent it with a tooth. You can cut it with steel." Caleb placed the tip of the knife against the brilliant yellow surface. He pressed down.
There was no dent. There was a sharp click. The stone didn't yield. It shattered. A corner of the nugget flaked off, revealing a dull gray interior. The yellow was brittle, fracturing into sharp, jagged shards under the pressure. The silence that followed was louder than the roaring river. Caleb looked up, his eyes full of pity. He handed the pieces back to Silas. "Pyrite," Caleb said softly. "Iron pyrite. Fool's gold." Silas stared at the broken stone. The shine was still there, but now it looked garish, cheap. It was a lie wrapped in a pretty color. The air rushed out of Silas's lungs. He felt his knees give way, and he sat down in the mud. The crushing weight of the disappointment was physical. He felt sick. "I thought," Silas choked, "it looked so real." "It always does," Caleb said, sheathing his knife. "That's why they call it that. It tricks the eye, but it don't trick the steel." Silas hurled the rock back into the river. It splashed and vanished. "I'm done," Silas whispered. He looked at his raw hands. "I'm done, Caleb. I'm chasing ghosts. There's no gold here, just mud and rocks and lies." He put his head in his hands. The shame burned hotter than the cold. He had written Ilara a letter in his head, telling her he had saved them. Now he had to erase it. Caleb stood over him. He didn't offer empty comfort. He didn't tell him it would be okay. "You can be done," Caleb said, his voice hard. "You can pack up, walk back to Sacramento, beg for a job sweeping floors." Silas didn't look up. "Or," Caleb continued, "you can get back in the water, because the sun is still up, and the rent on this claim is due on Friday." "What's the point?" Silas muttered. "The point is you ain't dead," Caleb said. He walked back to the rocker box. He picked up the tin can. Clang! "Get up, Silas." Silas sat there for a long minute. He watched the water rush by, indifferent to his suffering. He hated the river. He hated the gold. But he hated the idea of losing the farm more. Slowly, painfully, Silas Blackwood stood up. He wiped the mud from his face. He walked back into the freezing current. He picked up his shovel. "Dig," Caleb commanded. Silas dug. An hour later, as the sun began to dip behind the canyon walls, casting the river in a bruised purple shadow, they did the final cleanup of the day. They dismantled the rocker box. They carefully washed the riffles into a copper pan. Silas took the pan. He swirled the water, a practiced circular motion. The lighter sand washed over the lip. Swish, swish. He got down to the black sand. He tilted the pan carefully. There were no walnuts. There were no nuggets. But there, at the very edge of the black sand, was a thin, jagged line. It wasn't the brassy, fake glitter of pyrite. It was a deep, buttery, heavy yellow. It didn't sparkle. It glowed. "Caleb," Silas said, his voice steady this time. Caleb leaned in. It wasn't a fortune. It was maybe half an ounce of coarse dust. Real gold, the sweat of the earth. "That's $8, Caleb assessed. Maybe 10. It wasn't enough to save the farm. Not yet, but it was enough to buy beans. It was enough to buy powder. It was enough to buy another day. Silas took a pinch of the dust. It felt heavy and soft between his fingers. It didn't shatter. "It's real," Silas said. "It's real," Caleb agreed. "And tomorrow we dig deeper." Silas poured the dust into his leather pouch. He looked at the river one last time. The water was dark now, hiding its secrets. They were covered in mud. They smelled of sweat and wet wool. They were exhausted beyond measure. But as they walked up the bank toward their tent, Silas felt the weight of the pouch against his hip. It was a small weight, but it was enough to anchor him to the dream. He had tasted the fool's gold, and he had tasted the reality. He knew the difference now. He wasn't a greenhorn anymore. He was a miner, and the river still owed him. December 1849, Devil's Elbow, California. The law in Devil's Elbow wasn't written in leather-bound books, and it wasn't debated by men in powdered wigs. It was written in lead, sealed with blood, and adjudicated by the mood of the mob on any given Tuesday. Silas Blackwood stood knee-deep in the freezing slush of the American River, his breath pluming in the crisp winter air. He paused, leaning on his shovel, and looked up at the camp that clung to the canyon walls like a fungal growth. Devil's Elbow was less a town and more a festering wound on the landscape. Tents made of rotting canvas and shacks constructed from packing crates were stacked haphazardly along the mud bank. It smelled of unwashed bodies, dysentery, wood smoke, and the sickly sweet scent of rot-gut whiskey. "You dreamin' again, Silas?" Caleb rested his shovel against a boulder. "'Cause dreamin' don't move dirt." "Just listening," muttered Silas, his hand drifting instinctively toward the Colt Dragoon pistol tucked into his belt, a weapon he had traded his wedding ring for in Missouri. "It's too quiet up at the Crimson Tent." He looked toward the largest structure in the camp, a sprawling tent made of red canvas that served as saloon, brothel, and headquarters for Bartholomew Vance. Vance was a man who arrived with no pickaxe, but plenty of hired guns, and now owned a share of half the claims in the valley. "Vance is sleeping off a drunk," said Caleb, though his eyes remained sharp. "Let's get this gravel washed." They worked for another hour, the rhythmic swish-swish of the water the only sound. Then a shadow fell over them. 3 men stood on the bank. In the center was a man known as Spider, due to his spindly limbs and the web of scars on his face. He was Vance's enforcer. "Mornin', Silas. Mornin', boy." Spider spat the word at Caleb. "Spider," Silas acknowledged, keeping his voice flat. "You're blocking my sun." Spider slid down the bank, his boots squelching in the muck. "Mr. Vance, he's got a concern. He's worried about the safety of this claim. See, the river bends here. Floods come winter. You boys could get washed out." "We can swim," Caleb said, his grip tightening on his shovel. "Is that so?" Spider grinned, revealing rotting teeth. "Well, Mr. Vance offers insurance. For 10 ounces of dust a week, he guarantees stability. No floods, no claim jumpers, no accidents." 10 ounces. It was extortion. It was more than they made in a week. "Tell Vance we appreciate his concern," Silas said, stepping between Spider and Caleb. "But we'll take our chances with the river." Spider's face hardened. "That ain't the right answer, farmer. You pay the toll or you don't walk the road." "We staked this claim according to the code," Silas said. "We registered it with Judge Holloway." "Holloway's a drunk," Spider sneered. He took a step closer, his hand hovering over his hollister. "I'm taking the dust you got in that pouch, Blackwood, as a down payment." Silas didn't blink. He thought of the letter he had received 3 months ago. "Thomas is sick," Ilara had written. "The cough won't leave him." Every flake of gold in that pouch was medicine for his son. "No," Silas said. Spider drew. He was fast, but he was arrogant. He expected the farmer to cower. But Silas wasn't a farmer anymore. He was a survivor of the Salt Flats. Silas didn't draw his gun. He swung the shovel. The flat of the iron blade cracked against Spider's wrist. The pistol flew into the river. Spider howled, clutching his broken arm. "Kill him!" Spider screamed to the men on the ridge. Shotguns roared. The water around Silas exploded in geysers of spray. "Down!" Silas yelled, tackling Caleb behind a large granite boulder. Buckshot chipped away at the stone. Silas drew his Colt now, firing a single warning shot into the air. "Hold fire, damn you!" a voice boomed from the camp. The shooting stopped. Judge Holloway, a barrel-chested man in a tattered frock coat, stood on the bank holding a double-barreled shotgun. "I'll have no murder before noon. It ruins the digestion." "They attacked us," Spider shrieked. "We came to talk business and he broke my arm." "They tried to rob us," Caleb shouted back. Holloway looked between the two groups. He spat tobacco juice into the mud. "Camp meeting, sundown at the Crimson Tent. We settle this by the law of the camp. Until then, any man who fires a shot hangs from the cottonwood."
The Crimson Tent was stifling hot and smelled of fear. Every miner in Devil's Elbow was there, packed shoulder to shoulder. At the far end, on a raised crate, sat Bartholomew Vance. He wore a clean velvet vest that looked absurd amidst the filth. He sipped brandy, looking bored. Holloway banged a hammer against a whiskey barrel. "Order! The charge is assault, brought by Mr. Vance. The defense is self-defense." Vance stood up, smooth, cultured, a snake in silk. "Gentlemen," Vance began, "I offer order, protection. My associate merely offered a contract to these men, and for this kindness he was maimed. If we allow men to bludgeon each other with shovels, we have anarchy. I demand their claim be forfeited as compensation." A murmur of agreement went through the front rows, Vance's hired men. The rest of the room was silent, terrified. "Mr. Blackwood?" Holloway nodded to Silas. Silas stepped into the lantern light. He felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes. He looked at Vance, then he looked at the crowd. He saw faces he recognized, men he had shared coffee with, men who were just as desperate as he was. "I am a farmer," Silas began, his voice raspy, "from Virginia. I came here to feed my family." He walked the circle. "Vance talks about order, but ask yourselves, who are you being protected from?" He pointed at a miner. "Jacob, didn't you pay Vance 5 ounces last week? Did the flood stop, or did his men just stop kicking down your sluice?" Jacob looked down, shuffling his feet. "This isn't law," Silas roared, turning to face Vance. "It's theft. You didn't dig that gold, Vance. You didn't freeze in the river. You didn't leave your children." Silas pulled Ilara's letter from his pocket. It was tattered and stained. "My son is sick," Silas whispered, but the silence carried his voice to the back of the tent. "This gold is for life. Today, Vance wants my claim. He wants to take the medicine out of my boy's mouth." He made eye contact with the crowd. "If you let him take it, who is next? Which one of you is next on the menu?" The atmosphere shifted. The fear was overtaken by anger. "The jury will decide," Holloway announced. The jury was the crowd. "All in favor of Vance?" Holloway asked. 40 hands went up, the payroll. "All in favor of Blackwood?" For a second, nothing happened. Then Caleb raised his hand, then Jacob. Then, like a wave crashing against the shore, a forest of hands shot up. "The camp has spoken." Holloway slammed the hammer. "Case dismissed. The Blackwood claim stands." Vance didn't shout. He finished his brandy, placed the glass on the crate, and looked at Silas with a cold, dead smile. He tipped his hat and walked out. Later, outside in the cool night air, Judge Holloway lit a pipe next to Silas. "You won," Holloway said, "but you know what you've done, don't you? You humiliated him. A man like Vance trades on fear. You took his currency away." "He was going to kill us anyway," Silas said. "Maybe," Holloway nodded, "but now it's personal. The law of the camp protected you tonight, Silas, but the law changes when the lanterns go out." Silas looked toward the river, where the dark water rushed endlessly. He touched his gun. He had won the battle, but the war for the gold and his life had just truly begun. January 1850, the North Fork of the American River. Paranoia had a sound. It was the snap of a twig in the dark, the rustle of canvas when the wind was still, the sudden silence of crickets. Since the trial at the Crimson Tent, Silas Blackwood heard that sound everywhere. He stood thigh-deep in the river, his legs numb blocks of ice inside his boots. The winter rains had swelled the American River into a churning, angry beast of brown mud and white foam. It was dangerous work. A slip meant being swept downstream and battered against the granite boulders, but they couldn't stop. "Eyes up," Caleb murmured from the bank. Caleb wasn't digging today. He was standing guard, the rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. Bartholomew Vance hadn't retaliated yet, which only meant the blow, when it came, would be harder. "Any sign?" Silas shouted over the roar of the water. "Nothing but crows," Caleb called back, "but the crows are watching." Silas bent back to the work. They had moved upstream away from the main camp, following a hunch Caleb had about an old dry creek bed that fed into the river. It was back-breaking labor. They were using a long tom now, a longer, more efficient wooden trough than the rocker box. Silas shoveled wet, heavy gravel into the top of the tom. Scrape, lift, splash. The water rushed over the dirt, carrying the lighter debris away, while the heavier particles, black sand, lead shot, and hopefully gold, sank behind the iron riffle bars at the bottom. His back screamed. His hands were wrapped in rags to keep the skin from splitting in the cold. He was tired, not just body tired, but soul tired. The letter from the bank in Richmond was burned into his mind. Foreclosure imminent. "Rain's coming," Caleb announced. "Big one." Silas looked up. The clouds were bruising purple, heavy with snow and sleet. "One more hour," Silas pleaded. "We clear the riffles, then we pack it in." "Silas, the water is rising. If we don't pull the tom, we lose it." "Just this load." Silas shoveled faster, desperation lending him a frantic strength. He had a feeling. It was the same feeling he used to get before a summer storm in Virginia, a static charge in the air, a tightening of the skin. He cleared the last of the gravel pit. The water in the sluice ran clear. "All right," Silas gasped, wading to the bank. "Let's clean it." They disconnected the bottom section of the long tom, the riffle box, and carried it carefully to a calmer pool of water. This was the moment of truth. The day's wages were hidden in that box of black sand. Silas scooped the sand into his wide copper pan. He submerged it, swirling it gently. Swish, swirl, dip. The lighter sand washed away. The water turned cloudy, then clear. Caleb crouched beside him, the rifle still in hand, watching the process. "Looks thin, Silas," Caleb murmured. It did look thin, just black iron sand, the heavy, worthless grit that mocked every miner. Silas tilted the pan, washing the top layer off. His heart sank. Another day of labor for maybe half an ounce, enough for beans, not for freedom. He gave the pan one final aggressive swirl to settle the bottom, then drained the water. He stared. Caleb leaned in. He stopped breathing. There, resting against the lip of the copper pan, wasn't dust, it wasn't flakes, it was a slurry of yellow. But in the center of the yellow sand sat a stone. It was rough, jagged, and shaped like a teardrop. It was the size of a hen's egg. It didn't glitter. Glitter was for pyrite. This thing glowed. It absorbed the gray light of the storm and threw back a heavy, buttery warmth. "God in heaven," Caleb whispered. Silas couldn't speak. He reached out with a trembling finger and touched it. It was cold, heavy, and undeniably real. He picked it up. The density of it was shocking. It pulled at his palm. "It's a pocket," Silas choked, his voice cracking. "We hit a pocket." He looked back at the pan. The sand around the nugget was thick with coarse gold, gravel-sized chunks that would have been a fortune on their own. But the egg was the prize. "That's 5 pounds, maybe 6, Caleb estimated, his eyes wide. "Silas, that's $1,000 in one rock." $1,000. The farm debt was $700. Silas closed his hand over the nugget. He felt the sharp edges bite into his palm. This rock was the deed to his land. It was Thomas's medicine. It was Alara's peace of mind. He looked at Caleb. For the first time in months, he smiled. A true, wide, joyful smile. "We're going home, Caleb. We're actually going home." Crack! The sound wasn't thunder. It was the snap of a dry branch nearby. Caleb spun around, leveling the rifle instantly. Silas shoved the nugget into his coat, his hand dropping to his Colt. "Who's there?" Caleb roared. Silence, just the wind rising in the trees and the river rushing by. "I saw movement," Caleb hissed. "In the brush 50 yards up. A deer? Deer don't wear hats." The joy evaporated, replaced instantly by a cold, suffocating dread. They had just found salvation, but in doing so, they had painted a target on their backs. "Pack it," Caleb ordered, his voice low and tight. "Now, leave the long tom, leave the shovels." "Leave them? You want to carry a shovel or that rock?" Caleb snapped. "We have to move. If they saw us checking the pan, they know." Silas scrambled to pour the rest of the gold dust from the pan into his leather pouch. He tied it to his belt, checking the knot twice. The heavy nugget weighed down his coat pocket, banging against his hip like a pendulum. They mounted the horses in the falling rain. The storm had arrived, turning the world into a gray blur of sleet and mud. "Back to camp?" Silas asked. "No," Caleb said, looking at the ridge. "If Vance's men are watching, the tent is a trap. We can't sleep there tonight. Not with this." "Where then?" "The caves," Caleb said, pointing toward the limestone cliffs a mile downriver. "We hide. We wait for the storm to pass. Then we ride for Sacramento and the bank." They rode into the teeth of the storm. Silas kept one hand on the reins and one hand on his pocket, clutching the gold. He realized then that the old man at the camp had been right. The gold is easy. The keeping it is hard. Every shadow looked like a gunman. Every tree stump looked like Spider. The exhilaration of the discovery was already curdling into fear. He wasn't a rich man yet. He was just a man carrying a death sentence in his pocket. As they navigated the slippery trail, Silas looked at Caleb's back. Caleb was riding point, taking the wind, protecting the flank. "I need to split this with him," Silas thought. 50-50, that was the deal. But a dark, insidious whisper crept into his mind. $500 isn't enough. The debt is $700. If I split it, I still lose the farm. He shook his head violently, shaking the rain and the thought away. Caleb was his brother in all but blood. He would sell the farm before he cheated Caleb. Wouldn't he? The gold felt heavier now. It wasn't just metal, it was a test of the sieve, filtering not just the dirt from the river, but the character from the man. "Keep up, Silas," Caleb shouted over the thunder. "I'm with you," Silas yelled back. He spurred Jericho forward, into the dark, clutching the glimmer that could save his life or end it. January 1850, the limestone caves near Sutter's Creek. The storm had turned the world into a blurred watercolor of gray and black. Inside the shallow limestone cave, the air was damp and smelled of wet wood ash and fear. Silas Blackwood sat with his back against the cold stone wall, the heavy egg nugget pressing against his ribs inside his coat pocket. He hadn't slept. Every time his eyes closed, he saw the flash of the gold, followed immediately by the flash of a muzzle. Caleb was crouched by the small smokeless fire, nursing a cup of coffee. The big man was tense, his rifle across his knees. "Rain's breaking," Caleb whispered, looking out at the dripping curtain of pine boughs that hid their entrance. "We move in an hour." "To the assay office in Coloma?" Silas asked. "No, too public. Vance has eyes in Coloma." Caleb shook his head. "We ride south, cross Sutter's Creek at the Narrows, head for Sacramento through the back door. We bank it there." Silas nodded. It was a good plan. The Narrows was a treacherous crossing, but it was rarely watched. Just then, a sound cut through the dripping silence. A stumble, a cough. Caleb was on his feet instantly, the rifle leveled at the cave entrance. Silas drew his Colt, his heart hammering. "Don't shoot," a voice cracked from the brush. "Help me, please." A figure emerged from the rain. He was a skeleton in rags, shaking violently from hypothermia. He collapsed onto the muddy floor of the cave. Silas lowered his gun. He knew that face. It was gaunt, bearded, and aged by hardship, but he knew it. "Peter?" Silas gasped. He rushed forward. It was Peter Anderson, the young man from the wagon train, the man Silas had nursed back from the brink of death when the cholera struck on the Platte River. "Silas?" Peter looked up, his eyes glassy. Is that you?" "It's me, Peter, and Caleb." Silas helped the man to the fire, wrapping a blanket around his shivering shoulders. "My God, look at you. Where is Sarah?" Peter stared into the fire, his face twisting into a mask of agony. "Gone. The fever took her in Nevada. I buried her in the soft." A heavy silence filled the cave. Silas felt a profound pity. He remembered the young, hopeful couple from Ohio. Now, only this broken shell remained. "I'm sorry, Peter," Silas said softly. He poured a cup of coffee and handed it to him. "Drink this." Peter drank greedily, his hands trembling. "I lost everything, Silas. The wagon, the oxen. I've been washing mud for 3 months, not a flake. I was just looking for a place to die out of the rain." Caleb watched him from the shadows, his expression unreadable. "You're far off the trail, Anderson. How'd you find this cave?" "Luck, or bad luck. I saw smoke." Silas looked at Caleb. "He's with us, Caleb. He's family from the trail." Caleb didn't lower his rifle. "He's a desperate man, Silas. Desperation changes the family tree." "He's Peter," Silas snapped, offended by Caleb's hardness. "I saved his life. He's not going to hurt us." An hour later, the rain stopped. The woods were silent, dripping and misty. "We have to go," Caleb said. "Peter, you stay here. Dry out. We'll leave you some beans." "Take me with you," Peter begged, grabbing Silas's sleeve. "Please, I can't stay here alone. I'll work. I'll help with the horses. Just get me to Sacramento." Silas looked at the pathetic figure. He couldn't leave him. It went against everything he believed in. "He rides behind me on Jericho," Silas decided. Caleb sighed, a sigh of deep frustration. "Silas." "He comes." They set out. The trail to Sutter's Creek was slick with mud. The horses struggled for footing. Peter clung to Silas's waist, silent and shivering. They reached the Narrows, a pinch point in the canyon where the creek roared between 2 high cliffs. The water was high, white and angry. "We walk the horses across," Caleb ordered, "one at a time." Caleb went first with Barnaby the mule. He waded into the icy current, the water swirling around his waist. He made it to the far bank and pulled the mule up. "Clear!" Caleb shouted over the roar. Silas dismounted. "All right, Peter, you wait here. I'll take Jericho across, then I'll throw the rope back for you." Silas stepped into the water, leading the horse. The current was strong, pulling at his legs. He focused on his footing, on keeping the heavy gold nugget in his pocket from pulling him off balance. He was halfway across when he heard the click. It was a small sound, but in the canyon it echoed like a thunderclap. It was the sound of a hammer cocking on a pistol. Silas turned. Peter Anderson stood on the bank. He wasn't shivering anymore. He was holding Silas's spare pistol, the one Silas kept in his saddlebag. He was aiming it at Silas's chest. "Peter!" Silas shouted, confusion warring with the rushing water. "What are you doing? Put it down!" "I saw it, Silas," Peter shouted back. His voice wasn't weak, it was shrill with hysteria. "In the cave, when you bent over, the rock in your pocket, it's heavy." "Peter, don't!" Silas pleaded, holding the reins of the spooked horse. "I saved you. I pulled you back from the grave." "You saved me for this," Peter screamed, tears streaming down his face. "Sarah is dead, Silas. God doesn't care. I need that gold. I need to go home." "Drop the gun, Anderson," Caleb roared from the far bank, raising his rifle. "You shoot me, and I shoot him," Peter yelled, swinging the gun wildly between Silas and Caleb. "Throw it back, Silas. Throw the coat." Silas stood in the freezing river, the water rushing around his waist. He looked at the man he called a friend. He saw no mercy in Peter's eyes, only the madness of the mines. The fool's gold wasn't just rocks, it was the belief that men remained good when survival was on the line. "Peter," Silas said calmly, "if you do this, you kill your soul." "My soul died in Nevada," Peter sobbed. "I need that gold." A whistle blew from the ridge above. Silas looked up. Stepping out from the trees, looking down into the canyon like vultures, were 3 men. Spider stood in the center, his arm in a sling, a cruel grin on his face. It was a setup. Silas realized with a sickening jolt, Peter hadn't just stumbled upon them. He had been hunting them. He had sold them to Vance for a cut.